All right, everyone. Oh, I kind of matched the PowerPoint. Chapter 14 is going to talk about healthcare fraud and abuse, which has really become a big issue the past 30 years or so. Programs like Medicare and Medicaid have lost billions of dollars from fraud and abuse, as have private health insurance companies. So Congress and state legislatures have passed laws to try to help put an end to this. Okay. So, fraud and abuse is defined as false misrepresentation of fact that is relied on by another to that person's detriment, and is a departure from reasonable use. So it can be in the forms of word or conduct, including misleading allegations or just hiding facts that should have been disclosed. In the healthcare context, this would be a doctor or healthcare organization misrepresenting facts to a government entity or a health insurance company that they benefit from, either financially or otherwise. Okay. The most common forms of healthcare fraud and abuse relate to billing, what's known as upcoding, which is billing for a higher level of service than what was actually done, so they get more money for it. And unbundling, which is when you submit a bill for each component of a procedure instead of using the correct procedural code for the entire procedure, and you would get more money when you do it this way. Another thing would be a doctor referring their patient to a facility where they have financial interest. This is called a Stark violation. So if a doctor has some ownership in a pharmacy or some other type of clinic and he refers his patients there, and so then he in turn gets money from that, that is called a Stark violation. Or kickbacks is referring to when a doctor refers a patient to another doctor in exchange for money. Also a big no-no. All right, the federal government has responded to this by passing a lot of legislation. The first one we'll talk about is the False Claims Act, or FCA, which was enacted during the Civil War to protect the Union government from paying for products and services that weren't provided for them. In order to be in violation, it has to be proven that the healthcare provider intended to commit the fraud, or knew the statement or claim was false, and did it anyway. Over the past 2 decades, this has been used to protect the government from those that charge for services that they're not really giving to Medicare and Medicaid patients. Okay. FCA claims are typically brought as qui tam actions, which allowed private plaintiffs to sue on behalf of the government, and if they're successful, then they receive a portion of the money they won. Okay, so this private plaintiff is called a realtor, and they start the lawsuit on their own. The government can intervene if they decide to, or take over the lawsuit, or even join in with the realtor. But typically, the realtor is like a current or former employee of the doctor or the organization that finds out about the fraud and abuse and wants to expose it. And they are called whistleblowers. Okay. There's also the federal anti-kickback statute, which prohibits payment in exchange for referrals for federally payable services. Okay, so Medicare. A lot of states have also passed their own legislation, but for private insurance companies. So this kind of act would violate state and federal law. There are some exceptions to this called safe harbors that are allowed, but we're not going to go into those in this class. Okay, I already told you what a Stark violation was, but there are 2 different types of them. So Stark 1 prohibits this self-referral with Medicare patients to a clinical lab that the doctor or one of their immediate family members has that financial interest in. And then Stark 2 extends this prohibition to include other services, like the buying of durable medical equipment or occupational and physical therapy, home health, hospital services. Okay. Next, there are mail and wire fraud statutes that prohibit the use of the postal service or commercial wire services to commit fraud. Because most businesses routinely use the mail system or wire services, it would be pretty easy for a doctor that's committing fraud to violate these statutes. This type of violation is considered a felony, so it would include a fine, imprisonment, or both. Never want to commit mail fraud. To try to prevent doctors from doing these kinds of things, the federal government can apply the civil money penalty law to a violation, which would allow the Department of Health and Human Services to recover damages or money for these false or fraudulent claims. So under this, the doctor has to make restitution to the government, plus pay fines up to 3 times the amount of damages, plus an additional fine not to exceed $10,000. So if they, frauded the government out of $100,000, they would have to pay that money back, then pay fines that can be up to 3 times that amount, so up to $300,000 in fines, plus an additional fine of $10,000. So it's best to just never do these kinds of things, right? Okay, and kind of an even bigger deal to a doctor to prevent them from wanting to commit these frauds is the permissive and mandatory exclusion from Medicaid and Medicare, meaning they will not be paid for treating Medicaid and Medicare patients, right? Because the federal government, from our taxpayer money pays for these programs. So if a doctor's caught committing fraud, they will no longer pay these doctors to see Medicare and Medicaid patients. So this would be devastating to a doctor because most of them see a lot of Medicare or Medicaid patients. So it would cut out a lot of their income. HIPAA also addresses these fraud and abuse issues. It modified the civil money penalty law to include penalties for things like unbundling, upcoding, or even submitting claims after they've been excluded from participation. The last thing we talked about. It also criminalizes disclosing patient identifying information when the intent is for personal gain or malicious harm. Okay, people also, HIPAA also established or strengthened 4 programs to assist with fraud and enforcement: Fraud and Abuse Control Program, the Medicare Integrity Program, Beneficiary Incentive Program, and the Healthcare Fraud and Abuse Data Collect Program. Okay. The next major law is the Deficit Reduction Act of 2005, which changed the nature of compliance programs for some facilities from voluntary to mandatory, meaning now they have to do these compliance programs. It required employers to educate their staff on any administrative remedies to violations of the False Claims Act. It added more resources at the federal level to try to combat fraud, and it provided a financial incentive to states for them to adopt similar laws. That way everyone's kind of on the same page. And the last one is one we've talked about before, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, which just strengthens what HIPAA regulated. So it says that business associates are covered by the HIPAA security rule, so they have to meet all of the administrative, technical, and physical safeguard requirements, and can also be subject to civil and criminal penalties if they violate one. And it clarifies who can be held accountable for wrongful disclosure, whether it's a person or a healthcare entity. Okay, I think that was the last chapter. We talked about all of the major laws addressing fraud and abuse. Yes. Now, there are a few different law enforcement agencies that prosecute healthcare fraud and abuse. One of the most prominent ones is the Office of Inspector General, or OIG, which is part of the Department of Health and Human Services. So they look at civil, administrative, and criminal issues dealing with Medicare and Medicaid fraud. They've launched several initiatives, and they've successfully recovered a lot of money from them. So it's been going well. They have received a lot of criticism, though, because some people have said, what if this was just an honest mistake or just negligence, like being careless? Maybe they shouldn't be prosecuted and instead just need to be better trained. So DHHS responded by creating these programs to show, the proper way to do things so that they can't claim we didn't have any training, right? They have all these resources. The FBI has the widest responsibility of looking into healthcare fraud, meaning they have more jurisdiction than, say, the OIG, and they can work with a lot of different groups or programs and can look into whistleblower complaints. The Postal Service has a group called the Postal Inspection Service that can investigate fraud. DCIS, which is the Criminal Investigative Service, they look into any military health insurance fraud. And then at the state level, attorney generals can bring suit for fraud and abuse. It can take several years to conduct the investigation and do interviews and subpoena records for this process. So it's not like a quick thing. So if you, as a health information professional, is approached by a law enforcement agent with a search warrant, you should definitely cooperate with them, but you have the obligation to notify your legal counsel, right? And explain to the agent, like, look, I have to let our legal counsel know to make sure, I'm compliant with what I need to do. Once the investigation is done, they have to decide if they're going to go to trial or if they're going to try to come to like a financial settlement with whoever was accused of the fraud and abuse. Okay, compliance has always been a part of health information management since the beginning, to try to make sure the facility is complying with any accreditation standards, federal or state laws, codes of ethics, all that. A compliance program is in place to establish these internal controls, meaning what needs to happen on a day-to-day basis to make sure they're following all these laws and regulations and requirements. Compliance programs can be made from an ethics-based approach or a minimum legal requirements approach. So with the ethics-based approach, the facility is complying with all of these laws and the regulations because it's the right thing to do and it encourages good behavior. The minimum legal requirements approach is when a facility is going to comply with all these laws and regulations, but only out of fear of punishment, right? So they don't have to pay these penalties. Excuse me. Okay, so it really doesn't matter which approach the facility takes. The result is less chance of having to pay a fine or getting a penalty. It also does make it easier for providers if they know, this is how I have to do it. They can just do it that way every time. Part of the program is developing a centralized mechanism, excuse me, to distribute legal and regulatory directives, basically meaning like a specific policy and procedure on how to do these things. HIM professionals definitely help the doctors do this by making sure, they're focusing on the documentation process and by making sure they're using the right diagnosis and procedural codes. Compliance programs all vary depending on the doctor's specialty, but the OIG did release some guidelines that should be followed. They should have these key elements here. And so I don't have another coughing fit. I'll let y'all read those on your own. You can pause the video, read these key elements. Okay, the compliance programs are voluntary unless the facility receives $5 million or more in Medicare reimbursement each year. Then the Deficit Reduction Act requires some sort of educational or compliance program. The red flag rules, which were issued by the Federal Trade Commission, are an example of a mandatory compliance process. It requires doctors to create a program to try to identify, detect, and respond to identity theft. Okay, so if a doctor is accused of fraud and abuse, the federal government can impose a corporate integrity agreement, which is a written document that says what rules of conduct have to be done to remedy this fraud and abuse, and what monitoring and reporting requirements they're going to need to have going forward. These are usually a little bit more strict and expensive to implement than a compliance program. Some healthcare entities have started to use different technologies to help combat fraud, either by advanced analytics software or automated coding software. So the advanced analytics software lets everyone kind of look at the data to try to detect fraud. For example, an insurance company could look at the data before making a payment and validate the claim to prevent the loss, a possible loss from happening in the first place. Automated coding software assigns codes based on whatever guidelines are programmed in it. And then a coding professional or someone will come in and review it and make edits if they need to prevent the wrong codes from being submitted to the insurance company. Okay, that's all I have for you today. Good luck.